Hello and welcome to another episode of History Stuff. Now, I called this video Blunder at Barnet, and it's all about the Battle of Barnet, fought on 14th of April 1471. But it's really a continuation of my recent episodes about the life and career of John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford and staunch Lancastrian. And Oxford would play a very important, albeit unfortunate role at the battle. Hence the title of the video, Blunder at Barnet, because it really was a blunder on his part. So what was the battle all about? Well, the Yorkist king Edward IV, as I described in the previous video, had been forced to flee abroad by Oxford and his allies, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and George, Duke of Clarence. But this alliance didn't last very long. Clarence, who was one of Edward's brothers, he soon deserted Warwick's cause and went crawling back to Edward. And this was because Warwick had married his daughter Anne Neville to Prince Edward of Westminster, who was the only son and heir of the Lancastrian king Henry VI and his queen Margaret of Anjou. And by marrying his daughter to the prince, also Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, that pretty much ruined Clarence's hopes of ever becoming king himself, which is what he was really after, and the only reason he had joined Warwick in the first place. So he went sloping off back to the Yorkist cause, and this left Warwick and Oxford and their supporters to deal with Edward when he came back from the continent. He was backed by the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, who gave him some money, men and ships. He tried to land on the coast of Norfolk, but that was part of Oxford's territory, and he had prepared his defences very well, and Edward's men, when they tried to land on the east coast on Norfolk, they were driven back. So Edward was forced to sail north. He made landfall in Yorkshire eventually, although much of his fleet was scattered by a storm. He managed to make it through and land at Ravenspur, and he very cleverly went into Yorkshire claiming that he had only come back to claim his father's title of the Duke of York rather than the throne, rather than the English crown, which was a smart move because it divided people who might otherwise have opposed him, because while his claim to the throne was pretty dodgy and based on nothing more than winning it in battle, really, although he did have an ancestral claim, but it was realistically backed up by the sword, by violence. Nobody could realistically deny his claim to be the Duke of York, because he had inherited that from his ancestors. So Edward moved south quite rapidly, gathering support on the way. He moved through Lincolnshire, where there was a lot of support for him, while meanwhile Oxford and Warwick gathered their forces. Oxford in particular was able to raise about 4,000 men in the eastern counties, where he had his power base, particularly Suffolk, Norfolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire. He raised about 4,000 men in total, which was pretty good. And the two sides were clearly heading towards a major battle, a single battle which would prove decisive. Meanwhile, I should say, Margaret of Anjou and her son Prince Edward, who had married Warwick's daughter, they were still in France, they were still in Angers, because they weren't prepared to return to England until it became clear that their ally Warwick, that his grip on power was secure, which it clearly wasn't, so long as Edward was still alive, Edward IV, that is, two Edwards to contend with here. And until the Yorkists were completely destroyed and Edward was dead, then Margaret was not prepared to risk crossing over. So the two sides eventually faced each other in battle at Barnet, outside London, on the 14th of April. And here I'm going to read from a couple of chronicle sources to describe what happened. So the battle was fought in thick fog, which is not ideal, and Oxford's division was opposed by the Yorkist Lord Hastings. They were directly opposed to each other. And the Great Chronicle of London describes what followed. And I'm going to read this out in slightly medieval language, so I hope it makes sense. I'll try and make it sound as modern as possible. It happened there of Oxford to set upon the wing or end of the Duke of Gloucester Lord Hastings, not Richard of Gloucester. He was probably facing Hastings. Hastings' people, and after a sharp fight slew certain of them and put the rest to flight, and anon as they had a while chased such as fled, some returned and fell to rifling, and some of them thinking that all had been won, rode in all haste to London, and there told them that King Edward had lost the field. According to this account, Oxford's division defeated the division of Lord Hastings, put them to flight, but then Oxford and his men, some of them fell to plundering, to rifling the Yorkist camp, and others simply left the field thinking that that was it was all over, they'd won, and they rode off to London and spread a rumour that they'd won the battle and that King Edward IV, had lost. But this wasn't true, because Edward was still very much fighting, along with his brother Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III. Their divisions were still intact, and the battle was still raging. Now at this point I'll turn to Warkworth's chronicle, who describes this disaster that then befell the Lancastrian army, which up until this point had been doing quite well. But it happened so that the Earl of Oxford's men had upon them their lord's livery, both before and behind, which was a star with streams, and the mist was so thick that a man might not perfectly, I think, judge one thing from another. So that the Earl of Warwick's men shot and fought against the Earl of Oxford's men, waiting, thinking, I think, and supposing that they were King Edward's men. And anon the Earl of Oxford and his men cried, "Treason, treason," and fled away from the field with 800 men. So that's a little bit confused, but basically what it means is that the mist was lying very thick on the ground. Oxford's men were wearing his livery, which of course everyone wore their lord's livery, which showed a badge which showed a star with streams, and this was very similar to Edward IV's livery badge, which I believe was a sun in splendour or something similar. But although they weren't identical, they were very similar, and in the mist and the general confusion of battle, the Earl of Warwick's men thought they were being attacked from behind by Edward's men, while the Earl of Oxford's men thought that they were attacking Edward's men. In fact, the two allied divisions had accidentally blundered into each other. And then we go on to Fabian's chronicle, who says that if his men, Oxford's men, had kept their array, kept their discipline, and not fallen to rifling, likely it had been that victory had fallen to that party, to the Lancastrian party. So Fabian's chronicle is telling a slightly different story and saying that Oxford's men fell to plundering when what they needed to do was get back to the battle after they'd defeated Lord Hastings and finished off the rest of the Yorkist army. Instead they got distracted, and this was fatal. The Great Chronicle of London also mentions this rifling or plundering. And then a newsletter by Gerhard von Wessel, who I believe was a member of the Hanseatic League. He stated that 3,000 of Edward's followers fled to the rear, which, however, neither side was able to detect because of the fog. And so on. I mean, these chronicle accounts are a little bit confused, and the period language doesn't help. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult to extract the precise meaning. But the overall impression you get is that Oxford's men did well initially. They defeated the Yorkist division directly opposing them, led by Lord Hastings. They chased them off the field, but then got distracted. And I suspect that they scattered, they split apart, and in the fog and the mist and the general noise and confusion, some of them fell to plundering, others simply left, went back to London or whatever, thinking that the job was done. And possibly others accidentally attacked their own allies because of the confusion with the livery badges. Now, whatever the case, this confusion proved fatal to the Lancastrian army. There wasn't a great deal of discipline in these battles during the Wars of the Roses, and generally when panic started to spread for whatever reason, that was fatal to one army. This happened over and over again on the battlefields. And it's proved to be decisive tragically for the Lancastrians, and Oxford and his men fled, apparently after another half an hour's fighting. By this point you can imagine the total confusion and bloodshed and absolute chaos. I expect by this point nobody really knew what was going on. And after Oxford's men break and they quit the field, or what was left of them, that left Warwick to fight the combined divisions of Edward IV and Richard of Gloucester. They were outnumbered by this point, they couldn't hold out, and Warwick and his brother John Neville, the Marquess of Montague, were killed in the fighting. That's the end of Warwick the Kingmaker. And Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, who was also fighting for the Lancastrians, he's wounded, captured and imprisoned. So, unfortunately, Oxford played a major role in this battle, and not a very distinguished one. How much of it was his fault personally is unclear. Probably not much, to be fair to him. I mean, he did his job to begin with, but then lost control of his men. But that's not surprising, really. These medieval battles were chaotic. The conditions were far from ideal. I don't know why they decided to have a fight in thick fog. That could have gone either way. The Yorkists could have just as easily have lost the battle, or it could have ended in a bloody draw in which both sides basically lost control of what was happening and slaughtered each other to no great purpose. As it turned out, Edward got lucky, really. Fortune was on his side, and he won the battle. Edward IV won. He had come back from nowhere, really, from exile with a few hundred men, gathered an army in a relatively short space of time, and managed to pull off an impressive, if arguably very fortunate, victory, which left Oxford in a very bad position. He was now on the run again. But all was not quite lost, because, as I said, Margaret and her son Prince Edward was still abroad, and they could still raise an army and recover the advantage if they could meet Edward in another battle and defeat him. Were they able to do that? Well, I think anybody who knows anything about the Wars of the Roses will know the answer. But what followed was the Battle of Tewkesbury, which really did decide the outcome of this war, at least for the foreseeable future. And I'll go into that in a second video. By the way, if I've made any mistakes in that narrative, then I apologise. We're not perfect, none of us are perfect. Feel free to point them out if I've got any dates wrong, or locations, or what the various individuals are doing. My main focus in these videos is the Earl of Oxford, John de Vere. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you again. Thank you.